Doing a quick test. Testing to see if we can hear each other's audio is fine.
Okay, you sound good. I'm gonna wait for me. Okay, good. I can hear myself
Alrighty.
as well.
Sounds good. Alrighty. Welcome to the anime podcast, 2021 Spring Gauntlet. It's week 10 of the episodes, our 11th episode, and yeah, let's just hop right in. Some interesting stuff this week.
Yeah. So at number one, we're at contenders. This time we have only 11 shows, and so only the top six are considered contenders. So don't be surprised if the show you are vouching for or rooting for is not here. It's only the top six, and we're gonna kick it off with the weekly number one at Vivi Fluorite Eyes Song by Wit Studio. I gave it a score 7.4. You get a score of 8, which is both our highest scores of this week. So a rolling of average of 7.84. Funny enough, the rolling average went down by 0.03. Just to show how strong this show has been. Why'd you give it an 8?
I was very surprised by this show. I think this episode in particular. It ended up being like a very, shall I say, almost like a like it takes away from kind of like the pacing of like the relatively fast pace or kind of like action packed pace that I would say 80% of the episodes we've seen up to now have had been kind of like plot driven or very action filled,
Action oriented, yeah.
action oriented, and this episode essentially kind of took a 180 on that and really slowed it down to essentially kind of like a very introspective episode, right, where essentially Vivi is trying to figure out, like what's purpose, right? And I think that it's really well executed because that is kind of like a theme that the show continuously reminds you of, right? It's this the AI directive, right? This mission, and after Vivi loses Diva, right? She's kind of like this shell. She can't sing. She can't find the purpose to sing, which also kind of brings in a very interesting, shall I say, within show universe question of kind of like, oh, like what's like, how do AIs really operate in regards to their mission, right? Because essentially kind of the way the story is set up, at least on the surface, wants to lead you to believe that like she can't sing right now because, well, the part of her that had the directive to sing is no longer there, and so even though
Yeah.
there's another part of her that wants to continue to live on essentially Diva's life because the directive isn't there anymore, she can't really function and do that. And so she's running into the situation of, well, I can't really figure out how I'm supposed to do that at all. And eventually, towards the end of the episode, they kind of do like a callback, or not really a callback, but like kind of like a cue credits of literally the ending OST, right? Like it comes into it's her new song, right? And I just thought it was just like a very, despite like their, I guess technically from like a story perspective, like there wasn't like a lot of advancement. I thought that like
Yeah.
slowed down. It was just really beautiful, I think. Is
Yeah.
how the best way
So
to
yeah,
describe
I
it. Yeah.
think the pacing was very different from the previous Vivi episodes, and I think it
Yep.
was great.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, she's trying to find kind of like a new purpose, I guess, since she can't sing. We
Mm-hmm.
know that the song that she wrote is the ED of this entire
Yeah.
series, the song
Mm-hmm.
that's played. I think the nice nugget to have is we see who Matsumoto is, right? The
Yeah.
person who sent the program back to her. It was that kid, Osamu, all along. And we see how he cares for her and how, like, because it spans like 20 years, this entire thing. It took her 20 years to write the
Mm-hmm.
song.
Yeah.
So I think it was really nice. And I think
Mm-hmm.
at first, I was gonna give it a lower score.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, still a high score. I think I was gonna give it
Yeah.
a lower score until the after credit scene. Um, then it's like, oh, okay, now we're like getting into really interesting territory.
Yeah. Um, I think yeah. I mean I think it was, if you want to call it bold, it was bold. I think where they kind of like flipped the switch on kind of like the previous pace that we're all very used to, but I think it was executed really well. I think I enjoyed it a lot, and I think that it was more of a positive. Definitely, I think overall like it brought a lot to the table that probably wouldn't have been able to brought to the table in my opinion, had you presented it in kind of any other format slash method. So
So I think a topic I think we should discuss now that we
yeah.
have a like less shows to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
because I find it more difficult now to think about, like, for the maybe not this show, but for the other shows,
Okay.
what we should expect going forward, because there's only a few episodes for each of these shows. Vivi in particular has three more episodes, 11,
Okay.
12,
Yeah.
13. So a little bit more juice in its tank.
Hmm.
But seeing uh, what happened in the after credit scene, what are you expecting? Um, or what do you want to happen, I guess, as the show closes?
Um, there is. Okay, right before the show closed, right before the after credits scene, I was almost kind of wondering if it would go the route of 86 and kind of just be like, ta-da, here's like a, a nice close to the journey and just kind of close things off.
Mm-hmm.
We'll discuss 86 later, but
Yeah.
but it is somewhat related, I do think, because it was
Okay.
almost seemingly like it seemingly was about to head in that direction, and at least
Mm-hmm.
like before I saw the post credits scene, and
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
like, oh, huh, interesting. I wonder if this is just going to be, for reference, I did watch 86 before I watched this one, and so as I was watching this one, I was like, huh, I wonder if this show is somehow going to decide to like
Mm.
take the same route. Then
Yeah,
it
yeah.
wasn't. And I think that there is a. If I were to try to play devil's advocate against kind of like how the show I'm thinking will end up, which is essentially we. I think there's a chance that it gets almost like reset to like square zero, and it just
Again.
kind of like, yeah, it just like goes for a full loop one more time.
Oh,
Without trying to
interesting. Okay.
spoil
But they,
everything.
but
Yeah,
okay, but this time with the knowledge that she has.
yeah, it could be that, or or maybe it's like the ultimate sacrifice, right? Like it is
Mm-hmm.
another like relatively more canonical, just
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, like it would be like an ending of self-sacrifice where she's finally now completed her journey of self-discovery and she understands who she is, and because of this understanding now she goes above and beyond and actually makes some sort of grand self-sacrifice gesture with this new kind of like identity
Gotcha.
slash like composition in mind, right? So I think that's also a possibility. I think both of those are my predictions. Is that either we go for like a reset, like a full loop, or kind of like like that type of scenario, kick back to the beginning type thing, or we do like I said, like kind of like she's completed her character journey and now she's going to make some decision at the end. That's probably going to be like I said, like a noble self-sacrifice thing, but like
Mm-hmm.
is basically she can pull off now with her being a much more well-rounded person instead of who she was at the beginning, right?
Gotcha. I agree with. I think I could see the full loop again, just
Yeah,
because there's three more episodes. There's still a lot of time to cover some things, so
yeah,
I agree.
yeah. So it could go for either of those. I will say personally, I'll save some of this discussion for the 86, but I will say that I am glad it
You
didn't go
can,
that
you,
direction.
you can, yeah, yeah.
I'm glad it didn't go that direction. Yeah, I will. I'll save some of that for the 86, and I'll loop it back just because we've already talked about this one. But yeah, we'll come back to this one a little bit.
I was gonna say you can just go to the next slide. However, if you go to the next slide, you can introduce this one
And
because
for
it's a
number
change.
two, yeah, and number two, we finally have a change. Manatsu gave it a score of for those Snow White notes is now the number two spot. Manatsu gave it a score of 6. I gave it a score of 7. And even though the rolling average did dip by 0.04, it has now climbed one spot and it has reclaimed the number two spot that it had very earlier in the season. But it's back at number 2. Yeah, I thought this episode was it was almost okay. It wasn't too far off from what I was predicting. Essentially, after watching last week's episode, this is
Mhm.
kind of in line with what I was thinking of. Like, oh, like this is kind of how the episode will eventually go, right? You've had the final focus, the final arc, right? Of essentially, it's his individual performance, and then that is much more mirroring the sound of Grandpa versus his own. The whole theme of that, right? That comes back into the
Yeah.
focus, and that was what this episode was about. I do think that I was a little bit frustrated where I was kind of like, oh man, like I feel like okay, there's kind of two things that kind of left me frustrated. Number one was that I do think that the storytelling, just like Mars Red, where I felt like the storytelling was a little bit out of order, where like you should have introduced some of these characters a little bit, given them a little
Yeah.
bit more introduce the stuff a little bit earlier so we have some time to soak in and kind of like get some extra context so that the reaction that we get is a little bit more. You allow the viewer to kind of do a callback, and by allowing the viewer to kind of like engage their memory and like figure that stuff out, is more likely that you're going to be able to engage their emotions as well too, because you're
And
helping them do
appreciate it
some,
too.
yes, doing helping them doing some, you're putting the viewer slash the reader into an exercise, right, of like mental imagery, which is something that you want to do. And so I do think that had you introduced some of these characters earlier that they like now introduced, or give a lot more depth to a little bit earlier, I do think that it could have like gotten better results. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the number one, that was something that was kind of frustrating. Number two was that, well, I felt like this was just like the definition of like a tease again, where it's just like, you know, like did so much stuff, and like I'm not saying that like there wasn't like important things to be introduced, but like it's like we're so close to the end of the show, like we don't have that many episodes left. Like let's just come on, just give me some meat already. And I feel like this one was just once again like really like this episode's primary purpose just to set up the upcoming episodes.
Yeah. Um, I think I and I so I feel like two reasons why this show has become the number two spot.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is that it's I mean a few an episode or two back it kind of peaked a little bit because we went to the
Yeah.
climax of the group show.
Yeah.
The other reason I think is because 86 is kind of sliding.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
so what you said was true. And it's funny because as you were talking about that, the show that I keep comparing the show to, what is it called? What's the Sound of Music? Oh no, the Sound of Your Notes. I forget. I need to.
Okay.
Kono Oto Tomare is the name of
Okay.
the other show. That one does a good job with introducing characters first, and then
Okay.
you know all
And
the
then, okay.
characters who's performing,
Yeah.
and you know where they're coming from. And then when the performance happens, it's like, oh, there's more
Yeah,
depth
it
and
feels
meaning
a
to
little
it.
bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's
Which is-
interesting you bring up that point because I
Yeah.
agree. These characters are kind of new, so I don't feel for them as hard. I don't have an
Yeah.
emotional connection with them.
Yeah. It's kind of crazy because like in reality, right? Like I'm not even saying that this is like maximum good storytelling, but like even if you were to literally transplant like the cut of the screen time, right, and put it a little bit earlier in the show, like I still feel like just in making forcing the reader slash like viewer to engage is already nice. Obviously, the even better thing to do would be to toss in even more so that we get even more depth. But like it is kind of crazy to think that like legitimately, just literally almost a literal splice and cut, in my opinion, still would have done the show like a little bit more favors. Like if you just kind of like
Yeah, I've given this show historically lower scores because I think I got high expectations, and I think it kind of bumped up this time around just because it kind of fixed some of the stuff that I was complaining about earlier. So it definitely fixed. So I complained the group performances that when it came to the actual performances, it wasn't animated. It was like still shots.
Yeah.
At least in this individual, like a lot of it, you could see them strumming, and so I was like, "Oh my goodness, thank you."
Focus,
Yeah, and the exposition that they gave made sense to the music. I think because it's individual. So.
Yeah, it makes it a little bit easier, right? It's like the guy who like just wants to carve his own way with like the sliding, and that's
exactly.
Right? Like, it's a
and
lot
something.
More,
Something that like you don't even have to know music well to like kind of understand it. And I think the way it ended too wants me to watch a bit more. Like now I'm interested in what happens to this kid and what's gonna happen with the other performers.
Yeah, exactly. This one, does it have, in the topic of episodes left, does this one have 11, 12, and 13?
Just 11 and 12.
Okay, so the one doesn't have a 13. Okay, so we have 2 more episodes left. This should be interesting. Do we know if the manga like is ongoing? Is it just like?
I believe the manga is ongoing. Let me check. Yeah, it's still ongoing.
Okay, that actually kind of makes sense. So I'm suspecting that this anime, unless it somehow gets renewed for a second season, will kind of close the arc on just the individual performance, and then kind of just like leave you on a note like that. I do think that if we were to continue to tell, there's a lot more story that can be told, which makes sense that like the manga is still going. But yeah, that makes sense. Okay, alrighty.
Number 3 is 86. It went down by 1 spot. We both gave it a score of 6 for a rolling average of 6.83. So it went down by 0.09. So this one was interesting because when it was first introduced, like the first opening shot before the OP, my belief was like, oh, it sounded like they were kind of purposeless, and so they're gonna go back to fighting in some sort. But then the entire show, not much stuff happened really. It was a lot
Mm-hmm.
of reflection
Yeah.
for the members, and I think that's part of it. Part of it's because they kind of are escaping the war zone, right? And so
Yeah.
they finally have time to reflect.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I gave it a 6 because a lot of the other shows had still bad animations. I think this show did a good job with their animations.
Okay.
Uh, I'm not exactly sure what to expect for the next episode because there's only one episode left for the show,
Yeah.
for the season, and
Mm-hmm.
so uh, what's intriguing to me is that I understand that the focus is on these guys, and there's like no
Mm-hmm.
contact from the major, which who
Yeah.
I thought was the main character. So
Yeah.
that's like, on one hand, I'm kind of confused why she's not here
Mm-hmm.
anymore, to be
Yeah.
honest, and I'm wondering if we'll see her next week in the last
Yeah.
episode.
I'm kind of predicting that she, like, chooses to leave her society
Hmm.
and joins them, right? That's like the most, I would say, like the most straightforward slash predictable path as the story would take. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm predicting that's kind of what happens in the last episode. I think that it's I promise I'm not trying to be too inflammatory, but I will say this. I feel like this show pictured itself as like this sort of huge masterpiece that did a lot and almost like is willing to essentially pull out like an episode like this because it like views that it's already done enough in like all the previous episodes, and then as such it's like, oh, like you must sympathize with these characters so much that when we do something like this you'll still appreciate it and you'll view it as like a, shall I say, like and I know that, like, it's, I'm obviously reaching for straws a little bit here, and the parallel isn't
Hmm.
going to be 1-to-1, but it's like it's almost like a Better Call Saul, Breaking Bad s type of storytelling, where it's like, oh, like because these characters are so deep that like even if it's just a lot of focus on essentially inner turmoil or reflection or just purely kind of like just literally like, I guess, like characters and emotions, that like you'll appreciate it as a viewer because you're just so invested into the show, into the characters. I have a feeling that was kind of like the picture that they had in their mind when they decided to pull out like episodes like this, essentially ending the climax. Was it two? Okay, was it 2 episodes ago where actually Undertaker already like essentially finally confronts his brother? It was 2 episodes ago. Was it
I
two
think
episodes
two
ago?
because
Yeah.
last episode was them telling the major that they're leaving, right?
Yeah. So
So
right.
I
So
think it was 2 episodes ago. Yeah.
so like a show willing to go on episode 9, to go, we're already done, and here you go. Like this is like we sorry, episode concluding in episode 8, spending 9 and 10 going like we've already done enough. Now it's just like we're gonna wrap up like kind of like the emotional arcs of these characters. I feel like it's not necessarily. I do think that there's, like it's there is substance that is to be appreciated, like in this kind of character development. It's very realistic to someone who's asked the questions of like, oh, you show a big bunch of war movies, but what happens after, right? Like the Hurt Locker and a big bunch of movies like got awards because they finally talked about what it's like to be a soldier outside of being a soldier, right? Like putting that focus in there. So like there's not necessarily saying that like, oh, you can't talk about this type of stuff. It's just interesting for me that like essentially you put the climax on episode 8, and then 9, 10, 11 are all just like kind of like just,
Well, yeah. I
yeah.
mean, part of it too is this. So the source for this is light novel, and the light novel is still going.
I see.
So yeah, and so I think in terms of pacing, I guess they chose this because it ends the novel or the series of novels.
Okay.
Um, but it's
Yeah.
technically not the end of the story, which I
Yeah.
makes
Which
sense. I
makes
think
sense, right? Yeah.
it would be really weird if this is the pacing of the show and there's nothing else afterwards.
Yeah. I mean, like, I guess, like, we probably, I'm guessing 86 did well enough in Japan to the point where they're probably going to get a second season.
No idea. Typically, you'll
Okay.
hear maybe a season after, unless the show is really good. But
Okay.
typically, you have to wait till the season's over.
Okay. Yeah. So there you go. I mean, like, most likely they'll probably continue to pick up the pace on some future story. But yeah, I think that that's kind of what the show assumed. I felt like they didn't quite earn it. Like, to be honest, like I felt like the characters weren't as dynamic as maybe they had put it in their minds to be, and so
Hmm.
these last 3 episodes, although there is stuff to still be there. The technicals are still pretty good, the animations, all that type of stuff, but it
Yeah.
still leaves a lot to be desired, in my opinion, from like a kind of like why am I watching this show type of stuff. Like I
Mm-hmm.
feel like it hasn't quite gotten to the point where it's like, oh, like I care so much about these characters that like I would just continue to watch like things about these guys. Like I'm not that invested. I think it's kind of a little borderline, a little bit overestimated. I mean, yeah. But yeah, so that's where 86 is. This is by far going to be the most. I mean, by virtue of it actually being the last episode, which is not the case for these other shows, but this next episode, 86, is definitely going to have most of my curiosity as to like how they're going to
Mm-hmm.
actually choose to close it out. Especially like I
Yeah.
said, with the interesting way they kind of decided to, you know,
End the episode.
handle end the episodes. Yeah, like I said, climax, you knocked it out. Episode 8, and you're spending 9, 10, 11 doing winding down, which is very interesting. You're spending a quarter of your season, over a quarter of your season, doing winding down. So that's
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I'm interested to see. So my belief with the ending of this show,
Mm,
so they noticed there's a robot who's also part of the 86 or like the
yeah.
has the soul of
Mm,
86. So my belief right now is like, oh, their new goal because they were purposeless at the end. I think their new goal is to free
yeah.
the minds of 86 and the robots, which
Yeah.
then
I
Major will join them there, and that'll be the end of
I I
the
will
show.
say, almost to kind of make sure we add some positives, because I do think that the show is still decent. Um, Although it seemed kind of a little bit out of left field in my opinion, the if you were to take it out of just in a bubble, just in of itself, I do think that integrating the robot, the squeak squeak robot,
Yeah, that was good. That was a
was a
plus.
very well. It was pretty well executed in a bubble in of itself. Like I think that
Yeah.
it was like there was enough of constant reminder to the viewer that, oh, there's this bot that follows them around, and like putting you
Yeah.
into the putting it's like the Toy Story effect where like you now all of a sudden like it's done good enough of a job to the point where you feel a lot for an animate character, and you're beginning, or something that is conventionally inanimate, that now you're beginning to wonder, it's like, oh, does it have a soul, right? Like when you watch Toy Stories, it's like, oh, like, you know, all these toys that actually have a soul and stuff like that. Like with this too, right? It's like it's a robot. Obviously with this show, we've now figured out that many robots, the super advanced
Yeah.
ones, are actually human souls trapped in it. At least the show would like you to suggest that this one was just a manufactured one that was just a little bit more intelligent or better, like
Mm-hmm.
slightly better
Yeah.
neurally connected, but it still like felt like, you know, right, you saw the world through his eyes, and then watching him get blown up at the end is just kind of like a punch in the gut. You're like, oh man, like
Yeah, and I like the little flashbacks. We got.
yeah,
I think that's how you should be doing the reminisce game, right? Because we
yeah,
actually got to see the life, how the characters that are still alive, how they've changed, and
yeah,
have gotten a little bit more cold towards the
yeah,
end.
and
So
I think
I
like
did
it's
appreciate that.
yeah, and like just another quick shout out like for the red haired girl, right? You know how they I would have liked this if they kind of emphasized this a little bit more throughout the show, but in the beginning, more towards the beginning of the episode, they did emphasize like, oh, she feels like she's so childish, and like she just doesn't like. She seems like, you know, like she thinks like a kid. She doesn't think like, you know, like an adult with like, you know, sex, like for lack of a better, just to put it bluntly, like, right, she doesn't see them as like sexual beings, and she's just like this
Mm-hmm.
little sister of the group, right? They drop that little hint, and then through the robot's reflections or memories, you see that once upon a time she was a girl that was like, you know, like she was like getting embarrassed and like had crushes on people and stuff like that. And then as war goes on, well, she kind of like almost like reverts back, right? And it is kind of like
Mm-hmm.
it is a very nice show not tell type of thing, right? Where it's like, oh, like you literally see her like almost kind of regress, like I said, right? Like developmentally speaking, just as she gets more and more, you know, like wartime crap, like just continuously thrown at her, right? Like at the beginning, she was a person, right, that like, you know, like got like, you know, heart flustered about all this type of stuff, and then you see that at the end, like there's just no more spot, there's no more room of that left, right? And so
Yeah,
I thought that was
even
pretty
with
well
the
done.
even with the half royal blood too, because she
Yeah,
was in love with the other guy, and the guy
yeah,
passed away. You could see her like
yeah,
breaking emotionally. So
yeah,
I think that flashback really gave a big chunk of its score, in my opinion.
yeah, exactly. Like I still have to give a lot of credit to the flashbacks. Okay. And at number 4, is Odd Taxi. Number 4, Manassas gave it a score of 7. I gave it a score of 7.5, the rolling average. was 6.67, and it went up by 0.07, and it's still at the number 4 spot, but it's getting close. What did you think of this episode?
Yeah, so this show is still, picking up the pace. It's getting higher scores now. I mean, the fact that the average here for this week for us is 7.25 is big.
Yeah,
And there's just so many stuff going on. So Odokawa as a character is starting to become he's showing flashes of like just essentially one of like these yakuza bosses,
yeah,
right? And with how calculated he is, and there are
yeah,
moments, especially when he's talking to the alpaca,
yeah,
about how conniving and like how
yeah,
meticulous it is. He is. I was like, wow, wait, is this show gonna show like Odokawa taking over
yeah.
the businesses? So there's that.
Mm-hmm.
And then we get a little bit of a flashback of him drowning. We don't
Yeah,
know too much of what's happening, but we know he's drowning because there are bubbles and he's underwater. Uh, and I think the big mystery of the whole student that's missing, I'm still intrigued. It's still there at the ending. They said a mystery. They found a mystery kiss member that has passed away, and his words were, "Oh, that's not the right person, right? Or
yeah.
that's not her."
which is
So
which
it's
which is heavily alluded. I think the show's purposely
yeah,
alluding you to think that mystery kiss person is in his closet, right?
yes,
Like that. Like he can only say that so nonchalantly with a lot of confidence because he knows where the actual mystery kiss person is, right? Like so it's like
exactly.
so that's like what it's leading towards. It's pretty interesting. I think that yeah, I mean it's this episode um it was I think that number one, there were a couple moments that caught me off guard, I think, but it wasn't too cheesy to the point or too out of left field to the point where it kind of just like made me lose on my
The
immersion.
was one of them the
What?
capoeira scene?
Yeah, the capoeira one was kind of like out there, and I was like, ooh, what
Mm-hmm.
the heck? But like, it was still like, I think like how they handled their interactions after it happened. They don't focus a lot about how she managed to show up there and stuff like that. But I do
Yeah,
think that like how they focused the scene afterwards or how they interacted, I think was well done enough to the point where, like I said, like it kept me kind of in there. I will also say that it's I was kind of surprised that we managed to see the Fox guy also just try to take matters into his own hands. It's not like uncharacteristic of him, but yeah, he like actually
sure.
legit just goes, "Wait, I can't believe this is all about to fall apart," and just legit just goes for
From a
fucking murder.
taxi,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
from a taxi driver.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, just like about, and it just straight goes for murder, which is I was kind of like, oh, what the heck? But like, I guess it's still, it's not unbelievable because they've spent a lot of time establishing, well, this guy just actually cares a lot more about Mystery Kiss than he does about the Badger game
himself. Yeah,
like stuff. So
I
so yeah,
think so. I also like that they're. It's been a while since we've seen the two comedians, so
oh
they kind of
yeah,
flashed back again,
that
and
was
so their adventure is still going, is still
yeah,
happening.
and I personally those two were some of my. It's crazy because it's very hard. I think that all the characters in this show are really well done. But
Mm-hmm.
like even with that being said, those two comedians ones, I don't know what part of it just like hit like a little bit extra to home type of thing, and like I like really like those characters. I felt like it was
Yeah,
just like
yeah,
it was a very nice storyline, and to see them kind of recall back that was pretty cool. I think that like this is one of those shows. I think this is kind of like, to be fair, a lot of mystery things will probably have this quality, but like if you go back and rewatch it, it's like, ooh, there'll be so many things that you can kind of like see again. Like,
yeah.
like I
And I
recognize that the guy who like the college student who suggested that he wanted to team up with him, he was there before. Like,
yeah,
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 he
yeah.
was there before, and like it's just one of the things where it's like, oh damn, like it's actually kind of cool to like see all the pieces kind of coming in together. And yeah, I mean, it's like it's youthful optimism and wonderment, you know, being perfectly foiled, like the yin and then the yang on the other side of like
Yeah,
old grizzled guy who's been
the old
left
guy.
behind by the world, and like it's like I said, like it's just like it's elegant, yeah. Like I feel like the almost like the literary elegance of it is still balanced out by, I feel like the character is just being like very relatable and very grounded, and so yeah, I
Hmm.
definitely like that a lot.
Yeah, I think the biggest strength of the show is that it's so easy to follow. Like there's so many things that's happening, but everything happens sequentially, so you can kind of understand, right? Like Odokawa has like this humongous plan about
Yeah.
doing the robbery and foiling the robbery and trying to double cross Nobu and double crossing someone else. But you're
Yeah.
totally like you can totally understand where he's going because he like it's so sequential. So I think that's the big strength of the show.
Hmm. Yeah. It's
All right, so
alrighty. At
at number
number
5
5.
is Koikimo. It has I gave it a score of it's still at number 5. It has not moved up or down. I think for a long time. I gave a score of 5.9. You gave it a score of 7 for a rolling average of 5.95. So it's gone up by 0.06. What'd you think of this week's episode?
I thought that the interactions. Okay, let me put it like this. It's not like the things that happened in this episode were surprising, like sequentially speaking, like from the story.
Yeah.
Like, okay, this is going to be the next step. I do think that once again, although this isn't like a by no, there has not been an episode that I would like even in my wildest dreams give like a 10 or a 9, but I do
Mm-hmm.
think that it was the plot line between um the
Mm-hmm.
old dude's coworker
Yeah,
and him. I thought that was really well done. I thought that was very elegant
I agree.
and it was elegant yet pretty realistic. And I think that it was, or not even necessarily like realistic, but very believable. Let me put it like that. Yeah, very
Yeah,
believable.
I
I
really
think that
felt for the girl.
yeah, right. Like I think that it was quite well done. And I think that once again what this show whole genre, right? It's a slice of life romance. Like I think that it executes on those fronts pretty solidly. Um, yeah, I mean that's honestly like it wasn't like particularly like crazily wild, but like I was also watching like quite intently, right? And like it was I do think it was well enough to be quite engaging, and you like triggered a lot of empathy, right? You feels for things, right? Like it's just kind of like if I'm gonna be honest, right? Like you don't watch romance for like the crazy like the mind blowing, like unexpected turns and all that type of stuff. You watch it so that you can get the journey, the empathetical journey, right? And that's like that's kind of like we get to experience that quite handily, in my opinion, in this episode.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I agree in the fact that a big part of why this week's episode did well was definitely
Yeah.
the character of Matsushita.
Mm-hmm.
That's her name.
Okay.
Because it was I think it was very relatable. Like the whole oh she got initially she he said no to her, and so she
Mm-hmm.
took the day off, right? And then she was like, "Oh my goodness, what is it gonna be like going back to work?
Mm-hmm.
It's gonna be awkward." And then we see the first interaction between her and the main character, and it seemed pretty fun. I was like, "Oh, I guess
Mm-hmm.
she's okay." And then immediately after, she's like, "Oh my goodness, I say anything wrong?" I was like, "Wow, that's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
very
Like.
relatable experience."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then at the end as well, when he says when he's like, "You shouldn't be like looking for me because I'm not interested in you."
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and she's crying and eating the cookies at the same time. It's like,
Yeah.
I think she has been a great supporting cast in this
Yeah.
show, and
Mm-hmm.
adds a little bit more depth because she's essentially the foil to the age difference, the big glaring age difference between the two main characters, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
looking at that avenue and why that didn't work out, right? For example, is a great
Mm-hmm.
contrast to the main relationship. I think my biggest qualm of the show has been they should have addressed the age difference much earlier. Like I don't
Yeah.
understand why it hit him this late in the show,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
because I think it would be great for it to be addressed earlier,
Mm-hmm.
so there would be more episodes to talk about it. This show has 2 more episodes, so we didn't talk
Mm-hmm.
about, it, but Out Taxi
Yeah.
has 3 more episodes, so there's a lot
Okay.
more development for that.
Yeah.
Koikimo here has 2 more, so they have to wrap up at least the arc.
Yeah.
Because I think it's nope, the manga is actually finished.
Okay.
With 57 chapters, which leads me to believe it will be just one season. Typically,
Okay.
50-ish is about one season. So
Okay. Okay. So wow. So with that in mind, it almost I would applaud this show extremely heavily if it actually it isn't a happy ever after pairing of the two main characters. That being said, with that info of there only being that much chapters left, the show having 2 more episodes left, if I were to put in my prediction, it probably will end up being like a happily ever after between the two. They navigate the dynamics and they end up together, and then voila, like the story's done.
Okay, so I'm actually reading just in case. So I wasn't sure if my statement was correct. So a lot of
Okay.
people are saying that for every anime episode, it typically covers around 2 to 3 chapters.
Okay.
So under
So,
that logic, it should have one more season.
okay. Wait, 3 chapters. Oh yeah. Then it should have 1 more season. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so if it does have another season, and I mean, if it has the potentiality of another season, and rather the writers assumed as such and planned out the season as such, right? Like you're not actually predicting if it's gonna get another renewal, but if the writers were planning it as such, then maybe it won't actually be immediately wrapped up in a bow just as nicely. I will also be interested in to see how they decide to end this season. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not quite
I
sure
think
exactly what it's gonna
I think in my head it makes sense either something big happens, so they just call it off,
be.
or
Yeah.
they do get together and season 2 is about the ups and downs of the relationship, which I would applaud that for,
Yeah,
because
which
I
I
think
would. Yeah.
most mangas just don't do that. So
Yeah. Right. There's in my opinion, this isn't just as of I can't say this fairly and say this is only Western or only Eastern thing. I will say that from what my exposure to Eastern media, like a lot of it does seem to be abnormally focused on the pursuit phase, right? And there's not as much material
yeah.
on the relationship phase. And so it would definitely get some kudos from me if they were to actually kind of spend time exploring that. Alrighty.
Yeah. Now introduce the last show that is not on the drop list.
All right, To Your Eternity is at number 6. Kept a spot. Natsu gave a score of 6. I also gave a score of 6. The rolling average is now 5.78 and went up by 0.02. This was a pretty interesting episode. I will say that I can totally see now how this is the manga still ongoing? Yeah, the manga's still ongoing. I think tell me if I'm wrong. This one is going to like continuously go forward, right? Like this won't wrap up like as a season. It's just gonna continue.
This one has 20 episodes.
Okay, so 20 episodes.
And with the rate that it's going, I already know in my head where it's stopping. Because there's like in the manga, there's like
a
really big arc, and there's the arc where they're currently at. There's like a stopping point that you kind of know, and so I know with 20 episodes and with how this is pacing, they'll reach that.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, right away, right off the bat, it's very obvious to me, right, that this show's a little bit different from the other ones, and like saying like this one's nowhere close near the end, right?
Yeah.
I think that most of the other shows, like we're starting to see a semblance of approaching the finish line, or at least of, even if not of the entire story of the mini story or the seasonal story, and this one's nowhere near that because 20 episodes makes sense, right? I think that this episode in particular, I will say, not to say that like I don't enjoy the action in this show. Like it's okay. Like I think that it's passable. Like it's something to look at. That's not primarily why I watched the show. A lot of a lot of this episode's focus was essentially on kind of, shall I say, the mechanical aspects of the fight. I do think that most of the meat of this episode from a storyline perspective comes from essentially the spirit going, you can either choose to continue to evolve, or you can choose to essentially see yourself to the end, which is okay too. And that's how he puts it, right? And essentially we see that, yeah, man, this guy actually chose to he chose family, right, over evolution. And yeah, I mean, this story is nowhere near done. I think that that's the way you set that up, right? It's almost like we know the show has still a lot of runtime left, right? If this is actually 11 episode, 12 episode show, sure, maybe it's like, oh, like the thing is found a family, ta-da, it's done. We all know that's not going to be the case. Clearly, family is not going to end up actually being family. There's a big bunch of people in the poster that we haven't yet seen. He's clearly going to move to, different parts of the world and continue to evolve. And so, like choosing a family, probably not going to be forever. It is, like I said, in my opinion, outside of, shall I say, the spirit or like the stone spirit thing, Majig making the choice of staying with family, there isn't too much character development on Fushi's side.
Yeah.
I would say that it's kind of like, in my opinion, and in a very strong prediction, we're kind of wrapping up the story of Gugu and
Gugu.
and all this type of stuff. We're probably going to see an end to that. There's going to be some sort of tragic calamity that happens that causes him to, essentially the family he's chosen is no longer going to be his life. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And I'll give it that. So yeah, I think I gave it like a six, just because it's pretty good. It's nothing crazily outstanding, but it's pretty good. As I know that you've chosen not to comment on this one too much, just because you do happen to know a little bit more about the story than anime watcher would know. But what were your thoughts on the episode? Just, I guess, high level.
Yeah, I think it's just pretty solid the way they. So we knew from the cliffhanger on the previous week's episode, like, oh, how are you gonna fare? So they're calling the enemies knockers, and they were this guy was saying how, oh, you haven't absorbed anyone new. Like, how are you gonna beat the knockers? In this case, he didn't have to absorb anyone, but he did have an ally, right? The ally helped him, and that's essentially the same thing as absorbing someone, right? Because someone else is there too with you. So I'm glad they resolved it that way. It made sense. There's no like the power of friendship kind of stuff. Like, no, there you have an ally. Might not have absorbed him, but you had one. So that's how it's resolved. The next time the knockers come though, like what's new, right? Because at this point they know about this guy, so they'll be prepared for him. And you decide to stay and not evolve, right? So, and I don't think, I mean, we only got like a few minutes of the after the time gap, the time skip. So we don't know if he's made more allies or not, and I think that's gonna set up what happens to him next week's episode.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Alright.
you were describing
Yeah.
too about the calamity is gonna happen. I think the alternative too is that he just grows old with them, but he doesn't age, right? Like the spirit can just like evolve back, right? So the other calamities that he just outlives the people
Yeah.
around him.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Alrighty.
Alrighty, we're at the drop list. So the bottom five shows. So a lot of new shows added to this list, and a couple of shows that are perennial drop list shows. But yeah, we can start with the creme of the crap, which is Shadow's House. First timer here. Still at number 7. I get a score of 6.5. You get a score of 6 for a ruling average of 5.73. So it's gone up by 0.06. What are your thoughts this week's episode?
It wasn't. I'll just be very blunt and say that it pretty much, there wasn't anything particularly eye opening, or I guess like, oh crap, like from in comparison to the last episode. Pretty much like the whole thing of like, oh, the dolls get repossessed by the shadows was already known last episode. They kind of just dive into the mechanics of that a little bit more. In my mind, it was more of an expositional episode than anything, where it's just kind of like, here's like things, here's established context, blah blah blah.
Yep.
And that's pretty much it, which is why I gave it a score of 6. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I agree with the exposition. The way they handled the death of Shirley, which is Rum's shadow, was kind of meh. I thought it could be a bit heavier, a bit. It made make sense a bit more. The addition of the coffee mechanic is interesting. We'll see what happens. I think that'll be the main conflict between Kate, because Kate's spiel is that she wants Emilico to be a separate entity, right? Whereas, but the whole real reason why these adults exist is so that shadows could overtake them, right? So that's why Kate is like the main villain to the shadows community. So I'm excited to see what happens. But I agree that this week's episode, nothing much really happened.
Yeah.
At all.
Alrighty. At number 8, Nazi, you gave a score of 7. I gave it my lowest score of 5. And the rolling average is 5.59. It went up by 0.05.
Yeah, and the show is Tokyo Revengers.
And the show is Tokyo Revengers for the podcast listeners.
I can go first so that we can have more time for you. So I gave it a 7. So one of the reasons why I gave 7 is actually the highest score I've ever given this show.
Okay.
And I think the reason why is the past 9 episodes really, I didn't feel necessarily that the actions that Takamichi had were genuine. I thought they were
Okay.
kind of forced. I just was led to believe. But I thought this week's episode was a bit more well done in that department, where I actually kind of feel happy supporting the main character because I feel like I actually can understand where he's coming from. Whereas when he's done this in the past, it's like whatever. It's not really him; it's some other person around him.
Hmm.
So I like that a lot, and I like that I can finally support the main character. Animation was also semi solid compared to the other shows.
Hmm.
Yeah, and that's really all that I wrote here. But in a big lens view, not really
Hmm.
much happened because it's really
Yeah.
just that small fight in the
Hmm.
alley.
Yeah. I gave it a score of 5. 5 isn't even a bad score in my book, but it
Yeah, I was
does
gonna
end up
say
being, yeah.
5 is like it's supposed to be an average score, right?
Yeah, and it ended up being the lowest score. I didn't think it was that, like, it wasn't like horrendous. I will say it's interesting to say that you were like, "Oh, I appreciate this episode because like you feel like there's kind of like almost like reason to cheer for Takemichi." I almost felt like it was kind of like let me put it like this. I kind of have an urgency there's as a viewer, I feel like part of the allure of this show is to kind of see this kind of this two timeline thing, right? Go on. And I
Yeah.
have this urgency as a viewer to be like, oh, I want to see what the heck happens. And the past like 3 episodes have literally covered like less
Mm,
than 24 hours, and this just continued on the
yeah,
same
yeah.
trend. I think that it's okay. The fact that you were able to cheer for Takemichi's actions, in my opinion, comes from the fact that man has this aspect of his character been like literally hashed out like to the ground and beyond, and so it actually ends up coming off as more genuine. I felt like I guess just as a viewer, I have this kind of internal urgency of being like, okay, we already know he's like that. We don't need to spend another episode, kind of like establishing that again. I will admit that it does deliver an emotional moments that a viewer can vibe with. I think that that's definitely
Mm-hmm.
there. But I guess like the flip side of that coin being kind of like, okay, well, I'm already pretty sold on this is who this guy is. We don't need to spend another episode to deliver this because that's not the primary purpose I watch the show. Isn't to be like, oh, look at how these characters like grow up. It's more so here's a character coming from the future, trying to save the actions of the past. How does this man, who is like a young adult, navigate this world of middle schoolers, like late middle schoolers, early high schoolers, right? Like, how does he actually navigate this, right? And that's kind of why I wanted to watch the show. And so, yeah, I mean, that being said, to kind of take a step back, 5 isn't even that bad of a score. I just kind of wasn't particularly impressed by it either. And so that's the score that I gave it. Alrighty. At number 9.
Yeah, number 9 is Mars Red. Still at number 9, I gave it my lowest score, which is also 5, which is funny because I was also gonna say 5 is not that low of a score.
Yeah.
You gave it a score of 6 for rolling average of 5.51. Yeah, so I gave it my lowest score because I just felt again the show is kind of regressing back to over the top drama. And I think the
Mm-hmm.
thing that pisses me off the most is that we only see
Yeah,
Maeda-san
at
for
the
like a
very
little
end. Yeah,
bit.
at the
Like it's
very
been
end.
2 episodes. Just might as well just give me him. I wanna see him.
Yeah, right. Like, I think that the episode just as almost kind of like this is more of an aside for the people who have watched or listened to the show or will watch it in the future. The rating that I ended up giving that episode, the drama episode, I actually that's probably the one if I could like use like a amendment that would be the one that I go back and change. I ended up giving it a lower rating because I was really frustrated at how like kind of like it was executed. But in hindsight, the fault of the execution lied more with the entire show and not necessarily with that episode. So that episode, in my book, now kind of retroactively thinking about it, should have still gotten a good rating because in of itself it was very good. But the reason we thought
Hmm.
that that episode was so good, right, namely of the birth of Maida song, kind of well, this guy who already has very nuanced feelings about vampiricism and all that gets now thrown into this play, right, this play of
Yeah, yeah.
this ultimate play. Like the reason we thought the episode was so good is because well it's like it sets up for just such an amazing, like, sure, very dramatic but also like a very layered and amazing story of Maida. And I'm gonna be honest, for at least it seems like for both of us, like we've been watching these episodes being like, okay, we've set this like amazing epic arc to happen now. Let's see it. And legitimately, we got blue balled all of last episode. We pretty much got blue balled all of this episode too until the very end. And it's just kind of like, damn, like holy crap, like we could have like I wanted to see that. Like I think that it was like the show, like I said, like that show, if I recall correctly, actually ended up being your second highest scored 2 episodes ago. The Mars Red ended up being the second highest score of the week, I think. Was it
let's see.
right behind Odd Taxi, I think?
Through 3 weeks ago.
Was it 3 weeks ago?
Yes, 3 weeks ago. Week 7.
Okay. Yeah, week 7. And I'm earning that high of a score, like beating out Vivi, beating out like those Snow White Notes, beating out like in 86, because like it was actually like just so epic, right? It's like this is great. Like this is what, and when I read a Shakespearean play, right? Like this is the kind of like the things that I want to see, right? And it's almost like, you know, like it's so well, and like, man, okay, sure, you kind of got in a little bit more things about like, oh, it's interactions with, you know, some of the vampire kids being like, oh, you won't ever grow up, and like this, sure, there's some side character development, but it's like, man, like for a decent run of mediocrity, if we're gonna be honest, and finally having this, like, you know, finally this Shakespearean-esque thing come into the limelight, and then choose to blue ball for like basically 2 whole episodes is quite frustrating. I feel like it's like that's how you should,
especially when knowing that this season is it's a 13 episoder.
Yeah, so it's like we only now have 11, 12, and 13 left to explore Maida, which is, in my opinion, you could have easily done like 5 episodes with Maida.
Yeah,
like just with the amount of complexity and kind of like all the things that have been leading up to it, right? Like there's not only it's not only his story. There's a story of his there's a story of his being as a soldier. There's a story of his being as, you know, like a widow, right? Like a someone who was left behind. There's a story of him being like a general's son. There's a story of him being, you know, essentially like a Japanese army man, right? There's so many stories that you can explore of this guy, and you're choosing to blue ball essentially, once I'm going to stop using the same words, but you're choosing to skip his story and introduce other things. It's like, no, like you have this really great one, like we only have this much runtime left, like please let's just focus on this. Like it's just really my
you could honestly like, it's a 13, they elected a 13 episode. That means they could have honestly just not even done this week's episode, and it would have been fine in my opinion. You know what I mean? Like, right, it's like let me put it like this. Sure, is there more room to develop some of these other characters? Is there more room to develop that innkeeper, that shopkeeper guy? Sure. Is there more room to be able to develop, you know, the oldest girl in that group of vampire kids? Sure, there is. But like at this point, like, it's a drama. We aren't here to watch like incredibly well fleshed out characters, right? We're here to experience drama, and like it's just so unnecessary. And like I completely agree with your statement of saying that like this episode could have not happened, and it would have still been okay in the telling of a drama. Like we would not have missed out much. So definitely kind of frustrating. I am very this is definitely a duality of me being very frustrated, but at the same time also really, really, really wanting to see what happens next. Oh, for sure.
Yeah. At number 10, Natsu gave a score of 5 for Higehiro.
There you go.
Higehiro. At number 10, it technically went up 1 spot. Natsu gave a score of 5. I gave a score of 5. The rolling average dropped down by only 0.03. More probably due to the fact that the show started off kind of wobbly and it got better. But I will say that this is a pretty sharp decline from the last episodes. And for the viewers who may or may not remember, the reason why this score is so low is because pretty much what we didn't want the show to happen with the show ended up happening. So we essentially kind of had this.
Oh, you think so?
Okay. Let me put it like this. I think that it is not a guarantee. Okay. Let me to reference what I was saying earlier. We had this discussion, and both of us were really hoping that the focus would be on essentially her recuperation and the exploration of her trauma. That's what we wanted the show to be about. We didn't want it to be about, you know, essentially, yay, they're going to get together. I will admit that it did not 100% fall into that bucket, but the show purposely, like, kept that string very, very alive. Like, okay, like, let me put it like this: like, sure, technically, it doesn't explicitly go, "Oh, they're gonna end up together," but the dude dumps everything that he has to go spend time with her to adjust, even though, first of all, okay, like, sure, we're not in a court of law, right? Like, if you were to be very, shall I say, um, step back and kind of be quote unquote cold and calculated about the situation. You've already done more than enough to help this girl out. You've been, like,
Yeah, yeah,
very
yeah,
helpful
for
to her
sure.
journey, and now you're just choosing to go like this extra step because why? Like, and like, yes, I understand that there's a part of it where it's like, oh, you really care for her, but like, what, you're gonna like just toss away the life that you've developed, like this balance that you've developed. You're gonna toss this all away just so that she can feel a little bit more secure on her transition when you've even established in the show that essentially like, you have faith that, like, the brother's on her side, that things will be okay, and he gets essentially flopped over because, well, he has lingering what ifs. And even if, like I said, I'll admit that the show didn't 100% go into that bucket of, like, essentially the bucket that we didn't want to go into, aka it ends up being a romance story. But it purposely, very purposely kept the string very alive, and I'm kind of annoyed by it.
It's interesting you say that
Yeah,
because I thought they kind of closed it when they were talking about, oh, I wish you were my dad.
yeah,
So that I had a parent who supported me. I thought
mm-hmm,
when she said that, I was like, okay, I think it'll be too weird to start a relationship after you say something like that. Like, I wish you were my dad. So I thought they closed the book, but I do agree that I find it hard to believe
mm-hmm.
that so I disagree with the severity of him going after, like,
Okay,
because
yeah,
he's like, you can just take some days off and just go. I'm like, okay, sure, I think that's fine technically. Now the reasoning behind it, I don't really believe as much. Like,
mm-hmm,
you could argue like, oh, the reason why he's doing this is because before she arrived on the scene, he was
mm-hmm,
just like a mindless worker who didn't really care
mm-hmm.
about much people at all, right? If
Yeah,
anything. And so he finally has a relationship, right? That seems to be a father-daughter, right? Hopefully, a
mm-hmm.
father-daughter relationship with this person. Because it's a father-daughter relationship, like, oh, if your kid's going away, you kind of want to support her in this case, right? I just don't believe much has happened for me to believe that you
Yeah,
would do something like that. So that's why I gave this low score of 5. I just don't see, well, that coupled with the fact that not really much has happened this episode and last week's episode,
yeah,
really. Like,
mm-hmm.
it's just them mulling over whether or not to go. She finally decides to go, and he's just mulling over, like, should I go with her? But I agree. I think in terms of support, you can just let her go. Like, you don't really have to be there. I don't understand what changes, right? And if I'm
Yeah,
writing this story, it sounds like the writer is just making him be there because something's gonna happen
right. Which
there
is,
that requires
yeah,
him to be there.
yeah. I mean, and like, okay, like here's okay. Let me put it like this: you would hope in a real life scenario, let's say that this scenario were actually to play in real life, you would hope that if the girl goes, "Hey, you are my dad," or "I wish you were my dad," like, and all this stuff happens, you would hope that, like, hey, the book has closed and he is now just a paternal figure. I will, however, kind of almost put almost like a warning, like a, hey guys, remember that this is uh anime with, a purposely very long title. The animes have super long titles, so that when you pick up when you pick up a manga by the cover, when the name's really long, you can get a summary of it and just like choose to pick it up or not. Right? This is very squarely in that genre of being like, okay, title is really long and it's like a convoluted. It's not. Let me put it like this: these slice of life, the whole story's premise, as per suggested by the super long title, is that this is unusual, and there is still a part of me, like I said, that feels like uneasy about, like, oh, like there have been moments in the show where like I felt like it's like, oh, like it almost comes off as, shall I say, not trying to be super condescending, but it comes off almost as, oh, it seems like, oh, this like mangaka is like very, very, shall I say, like in depth and kind of like very like in touch with like a lot of depth, and then like something else happens in the episode where like, I'm not sure if that was like really actually like that well. Like there's definitely a part of me that's still like very cautious, like, oh no, like I feel like something weird could still happen with the thing. I feel like that it's like you said, like I feel like the reason he goes to follow her is because he needs to be there when something happens, and I'm kind of afraid of what that something is going to be. It's kind of like, my thoughts. Yeah, I'm a little bit afraid of what that something is going to be. But if this show survives, I guess we will see what happens next, right?
Yeah.
Alrighty.
All right. The last show is going to be Duran, The Princess of Blood and Snow at number 11. So it went up by 2 spots. I get
Yeah.
a score of 7.1. You get a score of 6 for a rolling average of 5.07. So biggest jump yet at
Yeah.
0.15. I think this is the first time that the story and the plot made sense.
Yes.
The way they told it, I understood it.
Yeah.
It was logical,
Yeah.
and I could follow. Because a lot of actions that happened in passages did not understand, and the
Yeah.
reasoning they did not understand. This one, oof, really great. Like the character it's a really sad backstory.
Yeah.
Between him, what he had to do, and him and the people that he was protecting. And I'm just so glad that we finally have a coherent story that feels emotional, that was well animated, and I was hoping that this was a consistent feature of this show from the beginning.
Yeah.
Because I think the animations is great about this show. So
Yeah. It took
I-
this long to get here. It finally got here. The reason neither of us gave it, like, let's say like a like a like a 7, I guess, like a like a super high score,
8 or
like an 8 or a 9, is because, well, even it's still very well within the parameters of, shall I say, a period drama, right? Like, even like I saw, like, that being said, within the parameters of a historical period drama, like, it is done pretty well, right? You have this story. Sure, it's a little bit cliche that, like, his story is basically his place in the plot is literally this. It's essentially kind of the same. You find out that essentially he set up his tutelage sets up Joran's story to be the same as his story. Is a little bit heavy-handed that they literally have kind of like the same thing, kind of, but
Yeah.
like, hey, like, listen, like, at least, like, it was very coherent. It made sense. There is now, like, a semblance of, well, hey, like, even if it's almost like a little bit Baroquean, and it's, shall we say, like, it's recursiveness, right? Like, it's still coherent. And it's like I said, it's a little. I will say that I feel like some of the gravitas of it is a little bit lost, because his moral dilemma and all that type of stuff is, like, basically the exact same as Joanne's, and we kind of get that, like, okay, this is like,
Yeah.
okay, if you were to take, like, if you were to, for some reason, try to take a very academic approach to, like, this is, like, almost like the perfect example of, like, trauma gets passed generation to generation, right? It's like, this is like intergenerational trauma. Like, this is a very good example of it, where, like, literally, like, the person that he ends up like, bringing up ends up committing things similar to what he did, because, well, hey, like, listen, like, it's like, it makes sense, right? It's like, this is a type of world that you were raised in. It actually makes sense that, like, something like this could happen. That being said, though, from, like, a storytelling perspective, is it, like, does it, like, kind of lower a little bit some of the gravitas of it when you literally have, like, okay, here's the story of Duran and, what was the little girl's name that ended up getting
Asahi.
Asahi. So, Duran and Asahi's story, literally 2.0, except this time is of the person who started it, right? Like, is it like a little bit like, like, kind of, but once again, like, at least, like, I do think that most people who watch this show, like, your expectations shouldn't have been for some, like, kind of mind-bending crazy shit. Like, this is kind of more or less what you watched it for, right? It's like for some cool action and, well, more, like, once again, it's drama. And I do think that on that front, right, it is quite satisfying, right, to see this nice backstory show up, right? It's like, it's going to be interesting to see how, essentially, I really hope that they handle his character very well, and how he chooses to interact with Joanne, because, well, I don't know how much he knows about the story of, essentially, Asahi, and I think he knows a pretty decent amount, from what we've seen. Like, he does know that, like, there's this whole thing where it's like, oh, like, I want you to eventually kill me, because, he was carrying out this mission, but because of the softness, you decide to take, like, it's a child. It's literally the same thing. I do think that there's a pretty decent amount of potential, even if it ends up being a little bit drama cliche of how, like, their interaction breaks down. And so I am actually, this is the first time that this is definitely the highest score this show has received from both of us. And, like, it's finally, man, is it almost by, like, is it by the anime universe wanted us to, like, hold on to this for long enough, right, that we can finally see some goodness come out of it in episode 10. But hey, It's finally here. And I am almost kind of glad that we managed to make it here so that we could experience this. It took 10 episodes
Yeah.
to get there, but we got there. This is going to be pretty cool. I kind of want to see what happens.
Yeah. And so it's interesting. So now we are down to the drop list.
Yeah.
And we now have 5 shows who, for the most part, have performed pretty well. But like we said, as the show goes on, it's a bit more difficult to decide. And because we are week 10, an even numbered week, that means I go first, which
Okay.
I think is the better choice here. I really had to think
Okay.
about why I am dropping a show. In
Okay.
the past, it's just been they're
Yeah.
they're bad.
Mhm.
But now I think a part of the reason why I will keep a show is because I kind of want to know more and kind of
Yes. The
it's
potential.
engaging, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think the one with the least potential, in my opinion, the one where I don't really care actually what
Yeah.
happens, and that show that I'm going to drop
Yeah.
is Higehiro.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
think of
Yeah.
all the shows, there's a certain limited number of avenues where the show could go, and
Yeah.
ultimately, I don't find it as interesting, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe next week's episode, he's there with her talking with the mom, and that's it. And I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, that's it.
Yeah.
And I'm just not that interested anymore. So I will be dropping Higehiro.
Okay. Yeah, this is tough. I will say that in my mind, Hero was the one. So, right. So hearing that you were the one that picked this week, the one that you hold on to Hero, pretty much dropped it for the exact same reason. In my mind, there's pretty much either. Let me put it like this. Yeah, I don't expect a climax to even happen until episode 13, right, for Hero. And even then, the outcomes either A, he becomes, essentially, well, he's going to be like an older brother figure. I feel like we've already pretty much explored the character's emotional growth and all that type of stuff, like associated with like the exploration of the baggage, his personal growth, her personal journey. All that has pretty much already happened, and you're just kind of like tying up, like almost like putting on a bow on a wrap, not wrapping up a bow, but putting on like a sticky bow with two-sided tape onto like a prison. It's almost like there because like, well, you should have one there, like, and it's like it's not that compelling, which is why I agree with dropping that show, which makes this decision a lot harder. If you were to ask me last week, Joran would have been the obvious choice, but it finally pulled one. Yeah, but it finally
I honestly thought last week when
Yeah.
we ended the show,
Yeah.
because I knew I was gonna pick first. I was like, oh, it's easy for me, Duran, and you have to
Yeah.
have a hard time. But in
Yeah.
this case,
Yeah, but
it was
now
Hero that was easy.
yeah,
And
so
you have a
here
hard
that's
choice.
easy. And Drawn is the show that improved the most. Yes, given that some of the shows towards the bottom have more room to go up, and that's partially why it improved the most. But I am very curious. Just okay, let me put it like this: Mars Red and Duran both will not be dropped because I'm just way too both of them, right? Maida-san, I like really need to see this happen, right? There are 5 stories that we can explore of Maida-san, like as a person that can be explored, right? This is like it's quite Shakespearean, if I may say so, right? Just heavy-handed because there's a play and all that, but yeah, like it's quite Shakespearean, if I may say so. There's so many layers that we can explore. I really want to see it, and boy, although has the last 2 episodes pissed me off by kind of like inching towards it, but not actually showing us it's finally here, right? He actually busts in to the room, so we have to see Maida-san next episode. There's no way that he won't be there anymore. Joran, same thing. I think that a little bit Baroquian and like the same story gets layered on, like this is like intergenerational trauma, all that. I really want to see how the show handles it. I can't drop those 2, so those 2 are out. Which leaves Tokyo Revengers and Shadow's House. Both of them have potential, right? Like in terms of like my interest. I do kind of want to see how Kate potentially, right, manages to overthrow the grandpa's plan, the Lord Grandfather's plan of making the clones like a perfect copy and actually just doing that. But in my mind, anything that she can contrive to overthrow him will seem a little bit out of left field. Okay, if you were to think about the context of the show, right, and all the nuggets that they've like shown to us, Kate is. People are kind of surprised that Kate can control suits somewhat. But first of all the observers are very cognizant of that. And secondly, it is made very abundantly clear that, oh, she can begin to control it. So it's not like she's some sort of like crazy master manipulator of suits. So anything that she can do to shall presumably take over somebody who is the master of suit, who is so good at it that, he sprinkles a tiny bit of his suit into their coffee because the coffee's black, they won't see the suit, they drink it in, and instantly they all get brainwashed, like assumingly this guy has very good powers over the suit, right? And he's a Lord Grandfather for that reason. Anything that she can do to overthrow him will kind of feel a little bit out of left field. Like a mechanic, even if it was some sort of mechanic that ends up enabling to overthrow him, it has not been introduced in the story, and it will feel a little bit out of left field. Okay. On the same token, first of all, do we even know how long Tokyo Revengers season is going to run? It's still a question mark, right?
It is the only show that is unclear the running. Like there's no information about how long the season would be.
Yeah.
We do know that the manga's still going though.
Yeah. I will say that just from the fact that the manga is still going, and if we're gonna be honest, I'm gonna assume question marks means that it might not end anytime soon. I do feel like the Tokyo Revengers story is also just gonna be dragged out so long, especially given the fact that the last 3 episodes have covered like a 4-hour span. Okay, it's like makes me think that like, man, is this story gonna drag on slowly and slowly and slowly. So there are cases for both, for why both Shadow House and
actually I have found how many episodes.
Okay.
It is going to be so Tokyo Revengers is going to be a 2-core season. So it's going to be 12 episodes this season, 12 episodes next season.
Okay. So we have 3 episodes left. No, actually 11 and 12, right? 11 and 12. So we have 2 episodes left for Tokyo Revengers.
Yes.
If I were to try to draw a prediction, essentially he saves Draken, but when he saves Draken, waves will happen, and most likely the fact that the manga is still going means his mission is not done. So it causes a butterfly effect, something else changes. My guess is, well, Mobius, there's still going to be some shit that happens with it. Okay, so, man, this is difficult. This is probably the most difficulty I've had is dropping a show. I don't think I've ever taken this long because it speaks to I will say it speaks to the quality of the shows. I will choose to drop Shadow's House. I think that both of these I have like pessimism for why I think that it's going to be, potentially droppable. That being said, I am still intrigued by both of them. I just think that in my mind, the best that Shadow's House could do at this point doesn't seem that interesting to me in comparison to the potentiality of the Tokyo Revengers premise in general, right? Of a guy going back in time and all that. So, we do technically have saves. Are the saves going to be exerted this week? Starting with you.
So it'll be starting with me, and I will actually use my save on Shadow's House.
Okay.
I think of all the shows here, at least I want to see Shadow's House. The other 2 shows that we were not thinking about, so Joran and Mars Red.
Yeah.
They are shows that I can easily drop next week if 1, they don't deliver what they're promising, or 2, they've delivered and that's it, and that's really all they have left, right? And so I was thinking about, if I use my save in Shadow's House, is there a chance that I will not be dropping the show next week and be dropping another show? And I think yes, and because of that, I think I will be saving Shadow's House.
Okay, alrighty, and I will not be electing to save Higehiro. I think out of the 2 of us, I was even less optimistic about it. So, yeah, I guess it doesn't surprise anyone that I'm not going to be exerting my save for Higehiro. So, with the results of that, we have now culled the list down 1 further, which means we have 10 shows left. All right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and so if you go ahead and refresh and go to the next slide, have everything updated. Here are the remaining shows, or these shows from the 2021 Spring Gauntlet. Just a few only that are colored.
I think okay. So, sorry, Shadow Sauce should be colored. I don't know.
Oh,
Maybe it wasn't colored.
refresh it again.
Okay. Yep. There you
Okay,
go. Okay.
it's good now. Cool.
Okay. Yeah. So Shadow's House was saved. We now have one save from my avenue left, but we are now down to our last 10 shows.
Yeah, so if you go to the next slide for our recap, tonight we had 11 shows, dropped one. Next week we will have 10 shows, dropping two. Presumably, you could still use your save. And then week 12, we will have 8 shows, and then selecting a Gauntlet Champions. And the only perks remaining at this point is your one save. And yeah, that is the recap for the season.
Yeah, we're getting pretty close to the end. For reference, the last week, week 12, the discussions for many of the shows will actually be around both the 12th episode and the 13th episode.
Yes.
So, yeah. If which most likely is going to happen, but like if 86 were to survive, it would be also done, and it will receive the Way of the House Husband treatment, where it's still technically eligible for Gauntlet Championship. So, it'll be available to be picked if we so decide to elect it. But outside of that show, the rest of these shows have some of these have both an episode 12 and a 13, and so the last week, if a show does have 12 and 13, they will be discussed concurrently with other shows, just episode 12.
Yep, exactly.
So,
We had a delay for 1 week in case something like this happens, and probably might be the president going forward as well.
yeah. All right. Well, let's see. If you wanted to support our
Oh yeah, if you want to support us, we have a Patreon community as well as a Discord community. All the links are below. I put them as slides, but I realized it'd be just easier to say that you can click on the links below and you'll take you there to the communities.
Alrighty, yeah, we're finally getting close to the end of the Spring Gauntlet. It should be quite, yeah. I mean, there's so much anticipation. The save was used. It was really hard for me to even drop a show because yeah, we got some good stuff left. So I for one can't wait to see where these shows go. Yeah, thanks for tuning in and listening, and we'll catch you next week.
Yeah. Peace,
Alrighty.
peace.
Peace, peace.